Assalamu alaikum students. I hope that you all will be fine and I pray for you that Allah Pak keeps you safe and sound in this current epidemic and rampant disease. Students, today I am going to discuss a Russian novelist, a Russian author. Uh, his name is Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. He is Russian novelist, story writer, essayist, and journalist. And he belongs to the golden age of Russian literature. And he considers one of the best author of Russian literature. Let's start a detailed analysis of his life, of his philosophy, and his work. Students, before discussing that particular author, it is very important to discuss Russian literature before. Because in this way you can get the idea about many aspects of Russian literature, about the philosophy of Russian literature, about the ideology of Russian literature, and cultural links and much more. So let's start that it is said that Russian literature is the most influential and developed literature in the world. It is influential because of its strong cultural links, because of its ethnic Russian people, and its long tradition of achievement in many fields. Especially when it comes to literature, we can see that the folk dancing, philosophy, and the classical music and the traditional music, architecture, painting, cinema, animation, and politics, which all have had considerable influence on world culture. And when we talk about the roots of Russian literature, then we can say that the roots of Russian literature can be traced to the Middle Ages, uh, when the epics and the chronicles in Old East Slavic were composed. Old East Slavic is basically the Old Russian language during 10th to 15th century, and some of the most famous literary work also belonging to that era, that time. But in the 18th century, its development was boosted by the work of Mikhail Lomonosov and Denis von. Okay, Mikhail Lomonosov is basically the scientist and writer who made important contribution to literature, to education, and science. While Danis von is the writer of literary comedy, whose main work are two satirical comedies which mock contemporary Russian gentry and are still staged today. While in 19th century that is considered the golden age of Russian poetry, the era of modern native traditional writers of all the time. This century is important in literature because of the emerged and produced work. And Alexander Pushkin, who is a Russian poet, a playwright, a novelist, who is considered to be the founder of modern Russian literature, often called as Russian Shakespeare. And in the next slide, I'm going to discuss the 19th century. So let's take a look on it. 19th century is very important century in Russian literature because by the end of 1880s, Russian literature had begun to change, and it was the time of rise and fall of Russian literature because at that age the great novelist was over and short fiction, poetry, and drama became dominating genre of Russian literature. So, in 19th century, the poetry of Mikhail Lermontov and Nikolai Nekrasov was very famous, while the dramas of Alexander Ostrovsky and Anton Chekhov, and I hope that you are familiar with Anton Chekhov, that you have read his books like The Man in a Case and The Complaint, The Grasshopper, My Wife are some of the famous books of Anton Chekhov. And the prose of Nikolai Gogol, Ivan Turgenev, Leo Tolstoy, and our author Fyodor Dostoevsky. So these are the prominent and significant authors of 19th century. And the first great Russian novelist was Nikolai Gogol. Then came Ivan Turgenev, who mastered both short stories and novels. And in the second half of the century, Anton Chekhov excelled in short stories and became a leading dramatist, while Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, in particular, were titanic figures, and many literary critics have described them the greatest novelist ever. And in the next slide, I'm uh, continuing 19th century with different aspect, with some historical aspect. Students, as I have told you that 19th century is the time of change, is the time of rise and fall of Russian literature. And in this slide, I'm going to discuss the reasons that why literature has both rise and fall at that time. In 19th century was the era of change because of 1917 Russian Revolution and ensuing civil war, when Russian culture was left in chaos and writers like Ivan Bunin left Russia. Then the new generation of talented writers joined together in different organizations with the aim of creating new and distinctive working class culture that was appropriate for the new state, the Soviet Union. And in 1920s, writers like they are enjoying the broad tolerance, means that they are accepting the change, means they are giving space to each other, and they are giving space to new emerging talent, while in 1930s censorship over literature was tightened with the policy of Joseph Stalin. This policy was based with socialist realism. And here I want to share that what socialist realism basically is. It is a style of idealized realistic art, and it was developed in Soviet Union, and it was official style in that country between 1932 to 1988. But in 1970s and 1980s, writers were increasingly ignoring official guidelines of Joseph Stalin, and and we can say that the literature got eased from restrictions. The leading author of Soviet era included Boris Pasternak and Mikhail Solokhov and many more. While the Soviet era was also called the golden age of Russian science fiction, that was initially inspired by Western authors and Soviet space program. And I also want to discuss an important theme of Russian literature here, that and that has always been the Russian soul. And Russian soul is basically the term in Russian literature that is used for uniqueness of Russian national identity. And the writings of many Russian writers such as Nikolai Gogol, Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky offer descriptions of Russian soul. Students, in this slide, I'm going to discuss 20th century as I have given you comparison of three centuries, 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century. So you can have better idea of literary change, and the philosophical and the ideological change in Russian literature, and also the rise and fall of Russian literature. So in 20th century, uh, it has become evident that Russians are the world's most reading nation, and this is the time when Russian literature is trying to maintain its success. So the beginning of 20th century ranks as the silver age of Russian poetry, and there are many significant Russian authors who have contributed in numerous literary genres. So that is the age when Russia has five Nobel Prize in Literature laureates. And as of 2011, Russia was the fourth largest book producer in world in terms of published titles. So, in this silver age, there are many significant poets, many significant writers, first rate novelists, and Nobel Prize winners. And the names are mentioned, so you can read them by yourself. Russian philosophy is very much close to Russian literature. We can say that these are the two sides of the same coin. Russian philosophy is basically having the agenda of developing Russia as unique civilization. So the Russian philosophy is blossomed in 19th century, and I have discussed 19th century in detail in my previous slides. So it is the era of change. 19th century is considered to be the era of change in Russian literature because on the one hand the Russian Revolution, and on the other hand the emerging new talent who created distinctive working class culture for new state. So Russian philosophy includes a variety of philosophical movements. That is why we can say that Russian philosophy is always marked by the deep connection to literature. And the main interest of Russian philosophy is creativity. And the Russian philosophy, it addresses the primary subjects like society, politics, nationalism, religion, and much more. So there are many Russian authors whose work is considered to be the philosophical work, but uh, two philosophers that are Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. These two are considered to be the famous, the renowned philosophers of Russian culture, Russian literature. Here are some notable philosophers of late 19th and early 20th century that include Vladimir Solovyov, Sergei Bulgakov, and Vladimir Losky, Vladimir Vernadsky, and there are many more philosophers of this era. While in 20th century, Russian philosophy became dominated by Marxism also. And now, students, I'm going to discuss the Russian novelist, story writer, essayist, and journalist, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. He was born in Moscow on November 11, 1821, and died in February 9, 1881. He belongs to multi-ethnic and multi-dimensional noble family. Means its branches including Russian Orthodox, Christian, and Eastern Catholics and Roman Catholics. But as far as his immediate ancestors are concerned, on his mother's side they were merchants, and the male line of his father's side were priests. Uh, his mother taught him reading and writing when he was only 4, but his father's approach to education has been described as strict and harsh. So, Dostoevsky was introduced to literature at an early age, and from the age of 3, he was uh, like a child who used to read heroic sagas, fairy tales, and legends by his nanny, Elena Frulovna. And Elena was the influential figure throughout his life in his upbringing and his love for fictional stories. So, his parents introduced him to the wide range of literature, including Russian writers Karamzin and Pushkin, and Gothic fictions and romantic works and heroic tales. So, Dostoevsky himself reports that his imaginations was brought alive by nightly readings of his parents. Means whatever the story was, he was influenced by that story. So, students, you can also understand this statement, the statement of a critic guide who said that Dostoevsky lost himself in the characters of his book, and for this reason, it is in them that he can be found again. Please read it carefully again and again so you can understand why Dostoevsky was famous as a psychological novelist. In this slide, I'm going to reveal some of the secrets of Dostoevsky's personal life, and I hope that it will kill your boredom. So, the first secret that I found is that some of his childhood experience found their way into his writings. When a 9-year-old girl had been raped by a drunk, he was asked to fetch his father to attend to her. This incident haunted him, and the theme of the desire of mature man for a young girl appears in his writing, in his works, The Devils, The Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, and other writings. And the second secret that I found is that although Dostoevsky had a delicate physical constitution, his parents described him as hot headed, stubborn, and cheeky. While in his social circle, he was described as a pale and introverted dreamer and the over excitable romantic. And the next secret of his personal life is that after graduation, he worked as an engineer and briefly enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. And also, he translated many books to earn extra money. And when he began to travel around Western Europe, he developed gambling addiction, which led to financial hardships. And for a time, he begged for money. And when he became the most widely read and highly regarded Russian writer, and he influences some of the writers particularly evident in his early works that led to accusation of plagiarism. Students, In this slide, I am going to discuss Dostoevsky as a writer. Dostoevsky is considered the best Russian novelist, story writer, essayist, and journalist. That is why many of the literary critics rate him as one of the greatest psychological novelists in the world literature. And he is the greatest and most influential of golden age of Russian literature. As far as the themes are concerned, his work explores the themes like suicide, poverty, human manipulation, and morality. And a, a variety of philosophical and religious themes are also explored in his work. Secondly, faith is the deepest and stronger element in his life, and that is also reflected in his work. So, being a psychological novelist, he explored human psyche. In fact, in literature, psychological fiction, as we know, that is the interior characterization and motivation to explore the spiritual side and the emotional side of the character. So, Dostoevsky's literary work explored human psychology in the troubled political, social, and spiritual atmosphere of 19th century Russia. And most of his work demonstrate a vision of chaotic socio-political structure of contemporary Russia. And secondly, his early work represent the basic dilemma of society, that is based on the hierarchy of society, that is the rich class and the poor class. And there is also another element that he frequently used autobiographical and semi-autobiographical details in his work. And the elements like gothic fiction, romanticism, and satire are also penetrating in his style. Okay, students, before discussing the famous work of Dostoevsky, I want to tell you about the description of Dostoevsky's work. His work fall into two periods that coincide with the time before and after his imprisonment. Students, actually, he was arrested in 1849 and he spent 4 years in Siberian prison camp that followed 6 years of compulsory military service in exile. So, how we can segregate his writing before and after his imprisonment. Anyhow, the first period that produced primarily shorter novels like novellas, short stories, and many of which have never been translated into English. While the second period, the later one, uh, this period represent more by the great novels. So, Dostoevsky's canon include novellas, short stories, essays, pamphlets, limericks, epigrams, and poems. And he wrote more than 700 letters, a dozen of which are lost. And his body of work contains 12 novels, 4 novellas, 16 short stories, and numerous other works. And you will be amazed to know that his work was translated into 170 languages. In this slide, I'm going to discuss Dostoevsky's significant and important work. And the first one, which I mentioned on the top of this slide, is A Writer's Diary. Because I have discussed with you that Dostoevsky is a multi talented writer, a multi talented person, and He is not only a genius writer, but a journalist, a publisher, and an editor too. And his collection of writings as journalist is presented in the form of a writer's diary. And apart from this work, some of his famous novels are like Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov, and novella The Notes from Underground. And let me tell you that this novella is considered to be one of the first work of existentialist literature. And some of the novels I'll discuss in next slide. The important novel, or you can say that the novels which I found interesting to share with you. Okay, come to the next point, that is about his first novel, The Poor Folk. And I want to discuss this novel as a great victory for Dostoevsky, because the first novel, that Poor Folk, it gained him entry into St. Petersburg literary circle. And this circle, the St. Petersburg literary circle, is formally known as Petrograd, um, from 1914 to 1925, and then later on it is called the Leningrad from 1924 to 1991. And the most important thing to share with you is Dostoevsky was arrested in 1849 for belonging to this literary group, and the reason is that they discussed banned books. And you will be shocked to know that he was sentenced to death for this crime, but later that sentence was commuted at last moment. In this slide, I'm going to discuss two of the most important or interesting novels which I found very interesting to share with you. The first one is Crime and Punishment, and the second one is The Brothers Karamazov. Okay, Crime and Punishment is the famous and successful novel, and alienation, pride, self centeredness is the primary themes of this novel, Crime and Punishment. Where at first Raskolnikov's the protagonist name is Raskolnikov. His pride separates him from society. But in the end, finally, he realizes his true nature of love after breaking the walls of pride and self-centeredness. So this is very interesting story and true to human nature, that is based on the psychological elements that make the work outstanding work of classic. Here, Dostoevsky's main aim is to explore human nature, transcending utilitarian calculation, and the nature of crime and guilt is intensely portrayed and described. So, students, Dostoevsky, during writing that novel, he was burdenized with a number of children left in his care after death of his brother and sister. So, come to the next novel, The Brothers Karamazov, and uh, this one I have selected to discuss with you because of its critical remarks that it is the greatest novel of 19th century, and it is the deepest and most complex examination of crucial philosophical question of human existence. It is one of the prominent novel belongs to mature period of writing of Dostoevsky, and that is why it focused on the mature subject like the mental anguish and more and the moral dilemmas. Its story is also very interesting because it revolves around a murder of Fyodor Karamazov and its effect on his four sons. So that is why uh, Dostoevsky discussed the problem of free will and the question of moral responsibility, and it addresses the conflicts between faith and doubt. Students actually, his conservative religious and philosophical inclination is evident through this novel. For example, Dostoevsky's question whether good and evil can exist in the world in which there is no God. Because of its subject, it is greatest novel of 19th century and remained a capstone of Dostoevsky's achievement. In this slide, I'm going to discuss the literary aspects of Dostoevsky. Literary aspects, student, you can say that the literary directions, the directions in which Dostoevsky worked. The first point that is Dostoevsky a literary realist, and it is considered and described by the critics that Dostoevsky is a literary realist, but Dostoevsky himself described a fantastic realist. Students, a literary realist is basically the movement at that time, I mean in 19th century, and that movement basically is a characterization and the depiction of that contemporary life in its everyday reality. So, a literary realist is a person who tells you about his life, about the contemporary life, and about the everyday life in reality in his work. Fine. And um, to understand this, the literary realist, if you understood the idea, then you will know that how Dostoevsky uh, said himself a fantastic realist. To prove that point, I have mentioned here Grossman's um, comment about Dostoevsky, that Dostoevsky is the inventor of an entirely new novelistic form in which an artistic whole is created out. So, there are many directions, there are many aspects in which Dostoevsky had worked, and his work expressed religious aspects and psychological and philosophical treatise, newspaper, the anecdote, parody, the street scenes, the grotesque and the pamphlet, and in all these directions, he combined ideas in his writing. So, the next point is that psychological issues are highlighted in his work and explore themes as suicide, poverty, human manipulation, and morality. And I think I have discussed this point earlier in the themes. So, as you know, that Dostoevsky has been considered a psychological novelist, and he explores human psychology. So, psychological themes include dreaming, first seen in his work White Nights, and the father-son relationships beginning in the adolescent. In this slide, I am going to discuss some more literary aspect of Dostoevsky. The first one is philosophical and social problem. Dostoevsky engages with profound philosophical and social problems, and these problems are revealed through the characters, where they are brought together in extraordinary situations, provoking and testing the philosophical ideas. For example, in his work, men of the higher social class although not necessarily high class, but there is an interaction that is most significantly with women who are socially inferior, usually powerless and compromised. And this relationship takes on many different attitudes in the various work, but in almost every case the woman turns out to be a greater virtue and the higher moral and spiritual constitution than the man, who nevertheless from his privileged position in society usually fares better than the woman. So there is also uh, interior characterization and motivation to explore the emotional side, the spiritual side of the characters. And the next aspect, the next literary aspect is religious aspect. And I think the religious aspect is very deep, very much complex. So I think I'll discuss it in the next slide in detail. But religious aspect, you can say that after his release from prison, as I have told you, the reason of imprisonment of Dostoevsky. So after his release from prison, Dostoevsky incorporated religious themes, especially those of Russian Orthodoxy, into his writing. So, in the next slide, I'm going to discuss the religious aspect in detail. In this slide, I'm going to discuss the religious aspect, and religious aspect is the most important aspect in Dostoevsky's work. Perhaps the most important of all themes in his work is the belief in God versus atheism. And if there is no God, many of Dostoevsky's character realize then either every human being is God or every human being is nothing at all. Another important aspect, that is number 3 point, atheism. Atheism usually appears in its most extreme state, that is in the belief that since there is no God, the human being must be God. Although Dostoevsky's proponents of atheism are strong willed, disciplined, and morbidly dedicated. So, in Dostoevsky's word, they need to accept the existence of God as their only chance for peace, or in the final analysis, for existing in the world at all. Although free will is also interpreted by these radical proponents as the ability to become God. So, the submission to the will of this divine God is the only means towards happiness. Those who fail to redeem themselves through God either perish or are subject to enormous spiritual and psychological torment. And students, these are the elements, these are the factors that earn for him the recognition as the founder of existentialism in literature. And ironically, from this point of view, Dostoevsky's belief in his existential writing rather than metaphysical. In this slide, I'm going to discuss the distinctive style of Dostoevsky, that is very important stylistic element, that is called polyphony. Polyphony is basically a type of musical texture consisting two or more, I repeat, two or more simultaneous lines of independent melody. Students, polyphony is a musical texture that is consisting two or more simultaneous lines of independent melody, and it is opposed to the monophony. Fine. And monophony is the one voice, the musical texture of one voice. while polyphony is the musical texture consisting two or more simultaneous lines of independent melody. And this term is introduced by Mikhail Bakhtin. This concept is introduced by Mikhail Bakhtin using a metaphor based on the musical term polyphony. And for Mikhail Bakhtin, the idea is central to Dostoevsky's poetics, Dostoevsky's work, his fiction, and he called him the inventor of polyphonic novel in which multiple idea voices coexist and complete with each other on their own term. I repeat that according to Mikhail Bakhtin, the idea is central. This important idea, this important concept of polyphony is applied to the Dostoevsky's work because, according to him, the multiple idea voices coexist and complete with each other on their own term. So, in literature, the polyphony is a feature of a narrative which include a diversity of simultaneous points and views and voices. So, uh, Bakhtin's primary example of polyphony was Fyodor Dostoevsky's prose, his fiction, his work, and Bakhtin contended that Dostoevsky's unlike previous novelists, did not provide a single vision or describe situation with a monologic author voice. Instead, he aimed for fully dramatic novels of ideas in which conflicting views and characters are left to develop unevenly. Fine, and in the end, I have here presented a quote of Bakhtin, the chief characteristics of Dostoevsky's novel is the plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousness, a genuine polyphony of fully valid voices. I repeat that polyphony is two or more simultaneous lines of independent melody as opposed to the musical texture. Fine. That opposed to the musical texture of one line. Polyphony is the multiple lines, two or more lines, uh, two or more simultaneous lines of independent melody. And that idea is presented by Mikhail Bakhtin. And according to Bakhtin, this idea is fully applied on the fiction of, on the poetics of Dostoevsky. Fine. Students, there are two literary movements at that time in 19th century, especially in French literature and in Russian literature. First one is literary realism and second one is naturalism. I have discussed a little bit about literary realism in my previous slide, and I'm giving you here a task to read these two literary movements and find out the influence of these two movements on Dostoevsky's work. So, this is your task. Students, I found it very interesting and I want to share this story with you, a Christmas tree and a wedding, and I hope you will enjoy this story and I recommend you to read it. Here is your question. Critically analyze the significance of Russian literature in the world literature. And I hope that you are able to answer this question and you have some valid arguments. So, good luck. Allah Hafiz.